There exists a wall between the average person and game development, and that wall is usually filled with complex math, a background in computers, and a work culture that slowly breaks you down as a person. So what if you're like me, and you have virtually no programming experience and are a disappointment to your father? Well, as gaming became more mainstream and more commercially viable, a market for consumer-friendly software that allowed the average player to create their very own monstrosities grew bigger and bigger. That kind of software, known as a game creation system, offers an alternative path to game development. Much like how your operating system's graphical user interface streamlines and simplifies the process of using the command line, the ultimate goal of most game creation systems is to allow users to create their own games without any prior programming knowledge. Alright, so that solves one of my problems. The widespread adoption of game creation systems has been a core factor in the rise of indie games over the last 20 years. With recent games like Dreams and Nintendo's Blockman Murder Simulator, AAA devs have thrown their hat into the game creation system ring. But it didn't start out that way. The early world of game creation systems were filled with stigmas and a lot of, I have no fucking clue what I'm doing. But the seeds for the current indie renaissance were planted long ago. There actually is some debate about what the first game creation system was. In between bouts of disco and mountains of cocaine, people in the 80s kind of forgot to write down the exact release date of their software. Generally, two games have claim to the title: Broderbound Software's The Arcade Machine and Budgeco's Pinball Construction Set, which both had their initial release in 1982. The Arcade Machine was released for the Apple II and the Atari 8-bit line of personal computers. Created by Chris Jockmanson and Douglas Carlston, the game allowed users to create their own version of a Space Invaders style shooter, creating custom characters, modifying enemy behavior, and whatever the I was doing here. It even let you copy your game to a disc and play it separately from the arcade machine itself, just like, you know, a real video game. What fascinates me the most about the arcade machine is how they ended up solving the whole what if my player has no programming experience problem, which does seem like a pretty daunting task. Consumer grade game creation systems weren't a thing before this. How would you go about making a game creator for someone who doesn't know how to code? No, seriously, this is a pop quiz. Give me an answer right now. Well, the solution was kind of ingenious. The arcade machine simply asks players how they want their game to function. It may seem simple, but considering the game limited you to one style of space shooter, it works. However, you can't really unlock the arcade machine's full potential without the 87-page tome of a user's manual that comes with it. There are bonus tips, practice exercises, and pages of explanations. Now, you may be wondering, sure, this system requires a lot of practice to fully utilize, but isn't each game kind of gonna feel the same if it's just variations on Space Invaders? Well, surprisingly, it just kind of feels like you're playing the same game. To be fair, Broderbund never claimed the arcade machine would be an all-in-one game creator, but still, it was kind of revolutionary. However, the game was looked at as a novelty, a tool for budding game designers or hobbyists before they moved on to coding their own games. A wide commercial release of a game made on the arcade machine was about as likely as people in the 80s going one day without doing code. Meaning it wasn't gonna happen. Meanwhile, programmer Bill Budge, most known for 1981's pioneering pinball game Raster Blaster, released Pinball Construction Set in 1982 for the Apple II. And yeah, you guessed it, the game lets you create custom pinball boards. Similar to the arcade machine, the game also allowed you to create a separate executable from PCS itself, so you and the boys could show off your sick custom pinball boards to anyone. However, Budge's choice to release the game himself through his company Budgeco hampered PCS's initial release. But the game would eventually draw the attention of entrepreneur Trip Hawkins, who approached Budge with an offer. Hawkins would re-release Pinball Construction Set through his new company, Electronic Arts. Oh, wait, I did that wrong. I mean, Electronic Arts. EA would re-release PCS in 1983. Likely because of their involvement, PCS had a much bigger impact on the computer gaming scene than the arcade machine, gaining rave reviews from various gaming publications as well as receiving several accolades. Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak said PCS was, quote, the greatest program ever written for an 8-bit machine, and numerous game designers and programmers have cited PCS as an inspiration. The game would end up selling nearly 250,000 copies by the end of 1989. And yeah, maybe by today's standards, this doesn't look like much. I mean, it's pinball. But PCS's historical importance can't be overstated, and its success sent a clear message to the gaming industry. Game creation systems were a viable commercial product. Pinball Construction Set's success would lead to EA creating a whole construction set series, although without Budge's involvement. Throughout the 80s, EA would release Music Construction Set, Adventure Construction Set, and Racing Destruction Set. Ah, nice, they changed it up for that last one. You're so fucking clever, EA. Both music and racing did pretty much what you'd think. Adventure Construction Set, however, allowed players to make their very own RPGs. The game was developed by Stuart Smith. The core Adventure Construction Set engine was the same one Smith developed for his previous adventure games, Alibaba and the 40 Thieves and The Return of Hercules. Adventure Construction Set influenced a generation of would-be developers, with old Todd You Can Go There Howard even stating that the game was the main inspiration behind Morrowind's construction kit, even right down to the name.
It just works.
Included with Adventure Construction Set was an entire game called Rivers of Light, and yeah, that was a pretty good way to sell the game and show off what it was capable of. Rivers of Light didn't feel like a tech demo or a tutorial, it was a full-on Western computer RPG that could have been a standalone release. Okay, remember people, this was 1985. Games were like this. Throughout the rest of the 80s, numerous game creation systems were released commercially, too many to cover here. But some notable examples include War Game Construction Set, Arcade Game Construction Set, and Gary Kitchen's Game Maker, which is possibly the first all-in-one game creation system, allowing players to have the freedom to create games outside of a specific genre. Players could create survival horror games, arcade space shooters, and whatever this is where you're killing little gremlin men. Gary Kitchen's Game Maker was, believe it or not, created by Gary Kitchen and released by Activision in 1985. Like many of these early game creation systems, it was crude and relatively stripped down, but marked an important evolution in the genre. In the following years, a few games attempted to pick up where Gary Kitchen left off, creating consumer-grade tools that, in theory, could allow the player to create any type of game. The 90s were an important, yet understated time for indie game development. The increasingly widespread use of computers and the growing complexity of video games limited the aspirations of many independent devs. The relative simplicity of computer games in the 80s that allowed bedroom coders to make commercial releases was vanishing. However, several notable game creation systems rose to prominence during this time, allowing aspiring devs to hone their craft, leading to the eventual indie game boom in the following decade. RSD Game Maker was created for DOS-based PCs and was the brainchild of one Gregory Andrew Stone, who came up with the idea when he was 16 as a means to avoid getting a summer job. RSD Game Maker had begun as a simple block maze game, but as Stone grew frustrated with his creation and began developing tools to modify the game, he realized that he had begun the first steps to creating a proper game maker. Stone would soon wrap his entire family into the project. His brother would help code, his father handled business and marketing, and his mother playtested. With funding from Stone's father, several advertisements were sent out to various computer publications. The game saw its initial release in 1991 and had a steady but niche following. Several factors hampered RSD Game Maker's mainstream appeal. First, the game cost a whopping $89 US, about 175 bucks today. While RSD Game Maker was more flexible than game creation systems of the 80s, its graphical user interface wasn't the most intuitive, and many struggled to get the full potential out of it. The game also had an insanely restrictive licensing agreement, which more or less prevented the widespread distribution of games made with RSD Game Maker. But I do feel like we need to cut Stone some slack on account of the whole he was fucking 16 at the time thing. You know what I was doing when I was 16? No, seriously, do you? There's huge gaps in my childhood that I just can't seem to remember. The mixture of RSD Game Maker's high price and versatility led it to become a popular piece of software to distribute illegally, with Stone himself even receiving a pirated copy unsolicited in a chat room. While no games made for it reached the commercial heights of games in the 2000s, there were a handful of cult hits created with the software, like the Zelda-inspired Blinky series. While RSD Game Maker didn't make the splash that future game creation systems would, it is a necessary part of the game creation system canon. Many future software programs would iterate and perfect ideas and mechanics introduced in RSD Game Maker, and many game developers, both indies and those who work for big corporations, have cited RSD Game Maker as an influence. Another blow to RSD Game Maker's potential popularity came with the release of ZZT. Although the game wasn't strictly billed as a game creation system, its user-friendly interface and vast options for customization essentially turned it into one. The game also only costed $12, and coupled with a less restrictive licensing deal, led to a wider distribution of ZZT games compared to RSD Game Maker. The game was created by Tim Sweeney and released through his company Potomac Computer Systems, later renamed Epic Mega Games, and then renamed again to Epic Games, and then renamed again to We Will Make Fortnite Until the Nuclear Apocalypse Games. At its core, ZZT was an action puzzle shooter, but the tools for customization were so extensive that users could create shoot-'em-ups, platformers, and even RPGs. A sequel, Super ZZT, was released in 1992, although Sweeney's decision to remove the game's accessible level editor kept the game from reaching the heights its predecessor had. However, in 1994, one Alexis Jansen, who was active in the ZZT community, would go on to release her own game creation system, titled Megazooks. The game essentially functioned as a spiritual successor to ZZT, offering a level of customization that ZZT's own sequel didn't have. That same year, French software development company ClickTeam released Click and Play, arguably the most accessible game creation system at the time. While Click and Play didn't offer the same level of customization as its contemporaries, its extremely user-friendly interface served as a great starting point for budding game developers, and there was even a version released for schools. Where was the game design class when I was in elementary school? We were stuck learning bullshit like division and history. While game creation systems like ZZT and Megazooks remained popular throughout the 90s within the insular world of indie game development, no games created during this time gained little more than a cult following. That all changed at the tail end of the century, with the release of Marcus Overmars Anemo, later renamed to Game Maker Studio. Game Maker Studio's biggest revolution when it came to making game design accessible came with its drag-and-drop visual scripting language. While Game Maker does use its own coding language, it wasn't required to make a game. Users without coding experience could design their whole game using a system of drag and drop windows, which functioned as a graphical interface for the code that was going on underneath. And in future versions, you could even open a separate window where Game Maker Studio showed you exactly how your drag and drop actions looked as code, so I can pretend I understand what any of it fucking means. Here we need to highlight one particular indie game developer, the enigmatic Klysum. He had spent years making games on RSD Game Maker, ZZT, and Megazooks, but often found himself limited when it came to what he could do with the software. With the release of Game Maker Studio, Klysum had finally found a game creation system that, more or less, allowed him to create whatever he wanted. Using Game Maker Studio, Klysum would release Seculus in 2003. The game was a puzzle platformer, though it played against many of the traditions of the genre. There were no enemies, the player couldn't die, and the game placed more emphasis on exploration. And to me, this is a beautiful example of what game creation systems can offer. Klysum's years spent honing their game development skills on unorthodox platforms like RSD Game Maker likely helped the developer to think about video games in a different way, leading to a game like Seculus that defied and broke genre norms. A design choice that, if Klysum had come down the traditional programming route, they might not have made. Seculus was a modest hit and became, at least at the time, one of the most popular games made using a game creation system. It essentially functioned as the beginning of the 21st century indie game boom and began shifting the discourse around game creation systems. Instead of beating you up and taking your lunch money because you used a game maker, both designers and general audiences began to view game creation systems as a legitimate means to create a game, and Game Maker Studio was confidently leading the charge. But it was far from the only game creation system that was popular. One particular popular piece of software had gained a somewhat troubled reputation over the years, a little thing called RPG Maker. Created by the Japanese company Enterbrain, RPG Maker had actually existed since the early 90s. Although more limited in the type of games that could be created when compared to something like Game Maker Studio, RPG Maker was, in some ways, even more beginner-friendly. Its graphical interface was simple, its event scripting language was easy to understand, and overall the game served as an extremely accessible tool for creating classic JRPGs, but perhaps it was too accessible. The software was so newbie-friendly that RPG Maker began to develop a bad reputation for low effort or just kinda samey feeling games. This looks like an RPG Maker game became a fairly common insult against Kickstarter indie RPGs and low-quality Steam releases, or in this case the Final Fantasy V remake. Seriously, Square, what is this shit? However, when in capable hands, the tool could be used to make amazing games. Seriously, here's a list of them, okay? Don't start getting pissy in the comments because you derive your sense of self-worth through the games that you like. ClickTeam had also released a series of game creation systems, iterating on click and play. Software like Multimedia Fusion Express served as a popular game creator for both hobbyists and legitimate indie devs. Over the decade, game creation systems gave birth to several indie hits. Derek Yu's 2008 hit Spelunky was made in Game Maker Studio, the surreal adventure game Yumi Nikki was made on RPG Maker 2003, and the unforgiving I Wanna Be the Guy, the movie The Game was made using ClickTeam's Multimedia Fusion 2. While the 2000s saw indie games and game creation systems gradually grow in mainstream popularity, the 2010s basically saw them dominate the entire gaming landscape. A handful of extremely popular games using Game Maker Studio would release throughout the decade, like Hyper Light Drifter, Shovel Knight, and Hotline Miami. Oh, also Undertale. Yeah. Fucking Undertale was made in Game Maker Studio, one of the most critically acclaimed games of the decade. Hell, what many consider to be one of the greatest games of all time was made on a game creation system. Scott Cawthorn's Five Nights at Freddy's was also made on ClickTeam's Fusion 2.5 engine, and that's straight up one of the most successful video game IPs of the decade. And in the middle of editing this video, Cawthorn quit the gaming industry. Who's telling Matt Pat? The rise of the mobile game market also further legitimized the use of many game creation systems, and many companies would jump on board the hype train in the hopes of grabbing some of that sweet microtransaction cash. Software like BuildBox would come around and claim to be the most accessible game maker ever, with particular emphasis placed on creating games for the mobile market. All you had to do was drop a quick $3,000 to use it. But hey, it was also used to make Color Switch, and I've dumped probably hundreds of hours into that game in an effort to not interact with other human beings. Over the 2000s and 2010s, many games would come along that offered users extensive customization and modifications, and while not directly labeled as game creation systems, were definitely inspired by them. People created their own games in Minecraft. Media Molecule's Little Big Planet series placed more of an emphasis on player-created levels than the actual story mode. Nintendo basically killed off 2D Mario with the release of the Mario Maker series. Massively multiplayer game creation system Roblox flew under the radar on its initial 2006 release, but has exploded in popularity to the point where it has one of the largest active player communities in the entire world. Although the chat seems to be 95% Predator. By the end of the 2010s, game creation systems were basically completely legitimized in the indie game scene. Enough hit games released that the idea of someone using a game creation system simply wasn't a novelty anymore. The next big evolution in game creation systems would come when AAA developers began to throw their crunch-filled hats in the ring. Media Molecule had spent the last decade making Little Big Planet's level editor as extensive as possible, but they wanted to take it further. The culmination of that idea came with the release of 2020's Dreams, a game creation system released exclusively on the PlayStation 4. Media Molecule's goal was to create a platform onto itself for creation and distribution of games. Dreams featured extensive tutorials that made it feel like you were just playing a game. The game also offers an extremely easy to navigate interface where users can find tons and tons of player created games, and the variety is huge. Arcade shooters, adventure games, hell, someone even recreated PT. I'm sure that'll save at least a few people from going homeless trying to play that game. At the time of its release, Dreams might have taken the title for the most accessible game creation system ever. Here was a software tool that didn't even require you to own a freaking computer, opening the world of game development to many people who probably would have never even thought it was possible to create their own video game. And even Nintendo, freaking Nintendo, the company that once had to manually approve every game that came out on the NES, just released Game Builder Garage. And sure, the types of games you can create aren't as vast as something like Game Maker Studio, but a game creation system made by Nintendo will unquestionably lead some players down the path of future game development. Picking up where Dreams left off, Game Builder Garage's tutorials feel more like puzzle games, teaching players certain programming and game design fundamentals while still feeling like a game. While it is highly highly unlikely that a game made in Game Builder Garage will be the next Undertale, I have no doubt that the game's accessibility will inevitably lead some budding developer down the path that will lead us to the next indie hit. And sure, the growing accessibility of game creation does pose some problems. Steam and Nintendo's eShop have been littered with low-quality releases, to the point where I'm pretty sure I could drop that piece of shit I made on the arcade machine on both platforms. But I think the legitimization of game creation systems is unquestionably a net positive. While I have nothing but respect for the people who know how to program and create games through the traditional route, the need to know how to code inherently limits the types of games that could be created, because it shrinks the pool of talent to people with similar backgrounds. Imagine if everyone who wanted to write a novel first had to learn how to code and create a functioning word processor. There would be tons and tons of amazing books that straight up wouldn't exist. The accessibility of game making has kind of led to a revolution, and I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of games that are genre defining, games that have recontextualized what a video game is, have been created using game creation systems.